Great. Welcome. Good afternoon to everybody joining us from the East Coast. Good morning and good evening for those of us joining internationally or across the West Coast. My name is Richard Haddock, Program Manager with the GW East Asia National Resource Center, which is an organization supported by a Title VI grant from the U.S. Department of Education, meant to expand accessibility of resources when it comes to learning about East Asian studies and to address historically marginalized or overlooked topics in East Asia. And it's my very proud opportunity to be able to invite us for this event, and also in recognition of National Hispanic Heritage Month, as well as Latino, Latina, Latinx Heritage Month celebrated at GW, where we want to highlight the stories of communities within, without, and connected to Latin America and the Caribbean. Before we get started with the event, I would like to go over just a few logistical items for everybody. We do encourage that everyone throughout the event submit questions to us so that we can have a very lively and fruitful discussion for Q&A after the presentations. If you would like to submit a question throughout the session, you may do so by using the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen. When you do type a question, please do include your name and affiliation so that we may know who we are addressing in the Q&A portion. If you do send something in the chat, we will politely ask to redirect you to type in the Q&A box just so that we can keep track of all the questions being submitted. Thank you very much for your cooperation on that. This session will be recorded and we will upload it to our YouTube channel after the event. So we will send a notification to all those who registered about when our video will be up and running. So with that, I'd like to introduce our intrepid moderator, Professor Hiromi Ishizawa, who's Associate Professor and Chair of the Sociology Department at George Washington University. Her research interests are in the areas of social and family demography, immigration, sociology of language, and urban sociology. Her primary research goal is to understand diversity and immigrants' pathways of incorporation into a host society. In particular, she focuses on the residential and familial contexts in which immigrants and their children reside, and how these contexts affect whether and the manner in which they are integrated into a host society. So without further ado, Professor Ishizawa, take it away.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. I'm very excited to be a moderator for today's event titled East Asian Diaspora in Latin America, a Transnational History. First, I'd like to thank the following organizations for their support: East Asia National Resource Center, NRC, Seeger Center for Asian Studies, GW Institute for Korean Studies, Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute, and GW Department of Sociology. Now I would like to speak briefly about today's topic, and I would like to introduce our speakers. So Asian migration to Latin America and Caribbean countries such as Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Bolivia, Cuba, and Mexico has a long history that goes back to the 16th century. However, this transnational flow of people is often overlooked. An understanding of this rich history of Asian diaspora benefits the interdisciplinary approach that covers historical and contemporary experiences of Asian immigrants and their descendants, not only in a local and national contexts, but also in a global context. This will certainly be highlighted by our esteemed panel of speakers today that I'm very looking forward to listening to. And the recent global pandemic has brought to light social and economic injustices across the globe. Racism and xenophobia have increased during the pandemic, and thus this is a timely moment to call attention to the transnational histories of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean communities in the Spanish, Caribbean, Central America, and South America. With that, I'm honored to introduce our speakers. First, Dr. Evelyn Hudehart, Professor of History, American Studies, and Ethnic Studies at Brown University. Dr. Hudehart has published about a dozen books on topics such as indigenous peoples on the US-Mexico border, Asians in Americas, with a special attention to the Chinese diaspora in Latin America and the Caribbean. And also diversity, multiculturalism, race relations, and minority politics in the United States. In 2019-20, Dr. Hudehart was the American Council of Learned Societies, ACLS, Centennial Fellow to research on the Chinese in the Spanish Empire from Manila in the 16th century to Cuba in the 19th century. The second speaker is Dr. Taku Suzuki, Professor of International Studies at Denison University in Ohio. Dr. Suzuki has conducted research on the Okinawan immigrant communities in Bolivia and Okinawan Bolivian immigrant communities in Japan, war and peace tourism in Okinawa, and post-World War II Okinawan repatriation from the Japanese colonial Micronesia. And currently he's researching on the digital divide within Central Ohio Bhutanese refugee communities that has impacted the community, it is responses to this COVID-19 pandemic and the struggles among Kurdish, Iranian, and other asylum seekers who pursue legal status in Japan. Third speaker is Dr. Rachel Lim, a visiting assistant professor at Texas A&M University, and she is also an accountable climate equity and scholarship fellow in the Department of History at Texas A&M University. Her research and teaching interest includes migration, globalization, and comparative race and ethnicity at the intersection of Asia and the Americas. Her current book project focuses on Korean transnational migration to and from Mexico from the start of the 20th century to the present. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Hudehart.
Okay, I'm gonna share screen, okay? East Asian diaspora in Latin America, transnational history. I'm gonna talk very quickly about the Chinese migration to Latin America and the Caribbean, and I'm trying to find a way to take this very long history and condense it in 15 minutes. So the question I ask is, how do we make sense of the central theme of modern world history? Tens of millions of people from one country, China, who through mass migration for 5 centuries are now distributed to every corner of the world, every continent, practically every country. And one way that I have found to make sense of this huge global history is to examine this vast migration over 4 to 5 centuries of time in the context or crucible of empires, European empire, the American empire, and even Asian empires. And here we have a map of the Spanish Empire as it took shape. And by the 16th century, the Spaniards had found a way to circumnavigate the Pacific, going to Manila. And in Manila, because the Spaniards brought silver to trade for beautiful Chinese project goods, they found that people from this province of Fujian were eager to go to Manila, carrying silk and porcelain and spices and ivory to trade for silver. And here's a very early picture of these early Chinese migrants to Manila. By the end of the century, a huge Chinatown was well established in Manila, consisting of 20 to 30,000 people, making it the first large Chinese community outside China. And I call this the beginning of the Chinese diaspora, but I also call this the first American Chinatown. Therefore, it links to Latin America because the Spaniards who went to Manila and the colony of Las Filipinas was administered by New Spain or Mexico. And so the Philippines and Manila was conceived as an extension of America. So I call this the first American Chinatown, no? And from Manila, what I call the Hokkien diaspora or the Southern Fujianese diaspora was launched from Manila, quickly spread with the arrival of other European empires throughout Southeast Asia, the Dutch, the British, and the French. Now, we don't have good time to talk about this, but I just want to mention that the Chinese diaspora began under Spanish Manila, and that this Spanish Manila was administered by Mexico. This is for Professor Suzuki. Professor Suzuki, we can trace a very early Japanese Christian immigrant to Mexico, to Guadalajara, as early as 1635. Now, Professor Suzuki is going to talk more about the Japanese in Latin America. So let me just go on then to the next great diasporic movement to Latin America. This happened in the 19th and early 20th century. First, when the American Empire extended to the Pacific with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was imposed on Mexico in 1848, by which the U.S. acquired the territories consisting of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, half of continental United States. The U.S. also annexed Texas, which has separated itself from Mexico. And gold was discovered in California in the 1849, as you know, and 10 years later, President Lincoln authorized the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was monumental. All of this meant that the West and the American Empire needed massive labor, which they got from attracting workers from this province, south of Fujian, from the Guangdong province, and not just the entire province. This is what is truly amazing. From a very, really small part of this region, which we call the Pearl River Delta, next to Hong Kong and Macau, these are counties, no? So the Cantonese speakers, and they extended, they built on what the Spaniards had developed, this trans-Pacific route, no? From America to China, and from China across back to America, to Canada, to San Francisco, Los Angeles, to all of the Americas, to Central America, do you see this? And all the way to South America, to Peru. But here's another route that's important, because how did they reach the Atlantic? Cuba being in the Atlantic, another part of the Americas that was in desperate need of labor. They had to cross a longer distance, going around the Indian Ocean, all the way around South Africa and into the Atlantic and into the Caribbean. So these are the two migration routes, as you can see. And from here, okay, so first then, even before San Francisco, even before anywhere in the US empire, Chinese migrant laborers were brought to work in Cuba alongside African slaves. Slavery was still in effect in the sugar plantations. And here you can see a Chinese worker working in the sugar field, carrying sugar cane to the refinery. And here we don't have time to go into this, but you can see that the number of Chinese laborers, which were frequently called coolies, it's a sort of a pejorative term, but it's also widely used, and alongside African slaves. This would have consequences that if I have time, I would like to go to real quickly. These Chinese workers to Cuba, very interestingly went with Spanish contracts for 8 years, but guess what? They also had a Chinese contract. So this is a bilingual document, a Chinese contract, a Spanish contract. Now, at the same time then, when the Chinese recruited from Guangdong, from the Pearl River Delta, went to Cuba, the same region of Guangdong province also sent a lot of Chinese workers to California for the gold mines, and later on to build the Transcontinental Railroad. You can see the long railroad, the blue strip being built by the Chinese workers through the mountains of the Sierra. And they were almost all men, both to Cuba and to California. But I put them together because it really was the same migrant, Chinese migrant flow. No? And then, of course, in 1882, as many of you know, the US passed a Chinese Exclusion Act. And where did these Chinese go? Well, they went to Mexico, northern Mexico, particularly along the border. Why along the border? Well, this reconnects the Chinese then to the American Empire, because by the 1880s, massive US capital was pouring into Mexico, particularly in the borderlands area along the border, where they invested in mining, mostly copper mining, which was a very, very coveted industrial product at the time for wiring and other purposes, and also for building railroads, taking the products across the border. The Chinese investors also invested in commercial agriculture. Here is the Colorado River. No, so this was an area of empire expansion of the United States, the US. The Chinese were there at just the right time, where they became the prominent food producers, what we call market gardeners, as well as grocers. They operated provision stores, grocery stores all over northern Mexico, particularly along the border region, supplying the newly emergent proletariat or wage earning force in the mines and the railroads, to supplying food and services. They, for example, also made shoes and clothing. Finally, the third kind of Chinese migration is what's taking place now. It's called the Xinyimin, or the new immigrants, to mostly South America, but also to Mexico, to places like Brazil, for example. This new migration is in temporal and spatial sense connected to Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, with Chinese investment in Latin America. And here you can see in Sao Paulo, Brazil, today, these massive Chinese urban markets selling all kinds of everyday consumer goods, no? From to a largely urban population, but also in some rural areas as well. And you can see that this is another a massive Chinese marketplace. No, this is outdoors, this is indoors. There's also a massive Chinese marketplace in Tepito, in Mexico City. And again, you can see the crowded nature of these urban markets. And these Xinyimin are mostly from, they're not from Guangdong and Fujian primarily. They are from elsewhere in China, but many of them are from the coastal area north of Fujian province, in two counties called Wenzhou and Qintian. So again, we see coastal Chinese predominating, but today not exclusively so. Here's just a picture of a Chinese shopping mall in Mexico. And I just had to push this in. The same kind of Chinese migration, Xinyimin, are also now going to Africa, in the millions of people, 2 to 3 million Chinese now in Africa. Before I finish then, Hiromi, do I still have 1 minute or so? Can you hear me, Hiromi? She can't hear me.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
You have 4 minutes.
Oh, good.
Yes.
I want to say one thing that really strikes me about Chinese migration to Latin America and the Caribbean that we don't talk about very much, but I think should become the focus of more research. And that is what I call the Afro-Chinese Caribbeans. Not surprisingly, the post-immigrant generations of Chinese in the Caribbean are often of mixed race heritage. That is the second generation and downwards of these migrants to Latin America and Caribbean. Why? Because most of those early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century immigrants that we saw in some of the slides I shared with you, they were almost predominantly men. And so when they wanted to form families, even if they had families back in Guangdong, China, they oftentimes formed a second family here, and they formed families with local women. And in the Caribbean, the local women are what we call Afro-descendientes, or African descendant peoples, no, blacks and mulattoes. So there is a special feature of the Chinese diaspora in the Caribbean with no parallel anywhere in the world. I call this phenomenon Afro-Asian intimacy because they form families. And of course, perhaps the most well-known one is Wilfredo Lam, the great Cuban painter. This is his father, who was a Chinese migrant, and his mother, who is a Afro-Cuban mulatta, they called him. No? His father, Lam Yam, and he was a colleague and a friend and a mentee of Picasso. And these are some of his paintings, which you can see in museums all over the world. And he represented what Cubans call Afro-Cubanidad, or the essence of being Afro-Cubans, no? Or in other parts of the Caribbean, another term you may hear is the term of negritude. And one of the things that Wilfredo Lam exemplified is the significance of African-derived religions called santerias in Cuban culture. And here is a modern day Chinese, Cuban, Afro-Cuban lukumi, or priest called Jose Un. No? So it's quite an interesting thing. And of course, they take Guanggong, which is a popular Chinese god, and they also Cubanized him, and he's called San. San, of course, is Spanish for a saint, or santo, San Fangong in Cuba. So you can see that the Chinese and the African religions of Cuba really merged and became syncretic, no? Produce a syncretism. Finally, one last thing, and then I know my time is up. I want to just share something that I think is absolutely fascinating, and that is the importance of Chinese Jamaicans to the development and growth of Jamaican culture, and particularly Jamaican music, the reggae music, the ska music, the other kinds of music we associate with the Caribbean. Why? Because this has a lot to do with the fact that the Chinese in Jamaica went out in all the small rural towns of Jamaica after the end of slavery, and they all operated these little grocery stores like this one. It's called a Chinese shop. And in these shops, just like this one, they tended to have space in front of the shop. And the local population would congregate in front or sometimes in the back of these Chinese shops after hours of work on the weekends, because what these Chinese shops had was that they oftentimes had the only radio in town. So music would come out of these Chinese shops, and everybody would dance and sing around the Chinese shops. And this would have a huge impact on the development of Jamaican music. Here we see the Chin couple, two of them, who became the greatest producers of Jamaican music in the 20th century. And we have here two Chinese, Afro-Chinese Jamaican bands, which became very popular. But again, we don't associate Chinese migration and Chinese immigrants with local culture. But I say that in Jamaica, you cannot understand the development of Jamaican culture and music without understanding the role of the Chinese, and particularly Afro-Caribbean Chinese. Finally, just to end this talk, the supermodel Naomi Campbell had a Chinese grandfather. So did Colin Powell. Some of you may or may not know that our former Secretary of State, General Colin Powell, also had a Chinese grandfather. So thank you very much for your attention. Very quick run through of the Chinese diaspora in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you, Dr. Hildehard. Next is Dr. Suzuki.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, Richard and George Washington University's East Asia National Resource Center for inviting me to this wonderful panel. I'm honored to be part of it. For today's panel, I would like to provide just a brief overview of the history of Japanese migration to Latin America, focusing on 19th to 20th centuries, and the migration of Japanese Latin Americans or Latin American Nikkei to Japan from the late 20s to early 21st centuries. And also just a brief snapshot of the Latin American Nikkei in Japan today. I'm going to end conversation with highlighting some of the key characteristics of Japanese diaspora to Latin America and Japan. So those are the sort of organization, starting with those three periodic descriptions of Japanese migration and Latin American Nikkei migration, and more sort of snapshot of recent development, and finally, key features of Japanese diaspora. So let me start with the pre-World War II Japanese migration to Latin America. As Dr. Fuduhar mentioned, the Japanese migration to Latin America can be dated back to 1600s, when Japanese mission was sent to Mexico, which was actually en route to the Vatican, Rome, but it ended up in Mexico. And also there are some record on Japanese slaves sent from the Philippines, Spanish Philippines to Mexico in the following years. But my discussion today primarily focuses on more recent modern migration. The Tokugawa shogunate ended in 1867, ushered in the Meiji era under the newly revitalized imperial rule. The rapidly changing Japanese society created a large swath of disenfranchised population, such as rural peasants who were freed from feudal order, but struggled to survive as small-scale or tenant farmers, especially after the Meiji government increased land taxes. Many peasants responded to their increasing hardship through domestic migration or international migration. Japanese government, meanwhile, saw out-migration, emigration, not only as a means to reduce the economic burden and potential social unrest, but also as a way to expand the budding empires' economic and political spheres of influence, directly or indirectly, which Dr. Fudo had also briefly mentioned as well. After the first group of Japanese migrants arriving in Honolulu in 1868, Hawaii, the mainland US, and Canada were their primary destinations. For the early period of Japanese immigration, Latin American countries were viewed as a second option for the would-be migrants. Some also viewed Latin America, like Hawaii, as a transit point for their eventual entry into the United States. As a result, Japanese migration to Latin America remained relatively small until 1908, and subsequently underwent a dramatic increase after 1925, which I will discuss that later. There are a few key pull factors, so to speak, from Latin American countries as well. Brazil, Peru, Argentina, and others already had a long history of receiving contract laborers and free immigrants, as well as, in the cases of Brazil, Peru, and a few others, slaves. Prior to the Japanese arrival, therefore, the region had a long history of influx from Africa, Europe, Middle East, China, and South Asia. The region also suffered from an acute need for the agricultural labor, particularly in Brazil and Peru after the abolition of slavery, and only modestly successful attempt at enticing European immigrants. Despite the growing anti-Japanese climate in the region's host society, growth in the number of immigrants remained strong, thanks to large-scale immigration to Brazil, which I will trace that in a moment. Just a couple of sort of snapshots of the pre-war Japanese migration, starting with Peru. Abolition of slavery in 1854 created a huge need for the farm labor in sugar plantations, as well as guano mines, concentrated in coastal areas. The planters and mine owners initially sought Chinese contract laborers, the so-called coolies. The abolition of so-called coolie trade in 1874, most Chinese migrants left plantations and mines and established small shops. During the same period, the Peruvian government promoted European immigration to increase labor supply, which resulted in Italian and small numbers of other European immigration. Sugar growers tried unsuccessfully to bind Chinese laborers to their plantations and subsequently recruited Japanese to supply cheap labor. In 1899, Japanese migrants first arrived in Callao, and several thousands followed to work mainly in sugar plantations. Many resisted the abusive plantation owners and fled or were expelled from the farms and moved to Lima and Callao. They worked as domestic servants, day laborers, or opened small businesses. As Japanese Peruvians gained some economic mobility, the hostility toward them also increased. In 1940, there was an anti-Japanese riots in Lima and Callao, which destroyed 800 businesses Japanese Peruvians owned. After the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, the Peruvian government joined the US policy by freezing Japanese Peruvian assets and sent more than 2,000 Japanese immigrants to internment camps in the United States. Brazil. Brazil officially ended slave trade in 1853, and the gradual emancipation of Africans took place. During the same period, the Brazilian politicians and intellectuals, adopting the dominant eugenic thought at the time, actively promoted European immigration and racial miscegenation as a means to racially, quote unquote, whiten the society. Coffee plantations in Sao Paulo state were especially enthusiastic about introducing immigrant laborers. After Italian immigrants completed their labor contracts and left the terms, the planters looked for another reliable and cheap labor source. In 1896, Brazilian and Japanese governments negotiated the migration arrangements, and in 1907, the state of São Paulo officially signed an agreement on Japanese labor migration. The US Immigration Act of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, that effectively banned immigration from Asian countries, funneled Japanese immigration to Brazil. Japanese migration to Brazil from 1925 to 37 accounted for 2/3 of all out-migrants to Latin America, while the number of Japanese migration to North America decreased sharply. In 1936, meanwhile, the number of Japanese migration to Brazil escalated, despite the movements toward immigration restrictions. With the rise of anti-Japanese sentiment, shaped by both xenophobia against Asians and the fear of expansion of the Japanese empire, Japanese migration to Latin America was virtually eliminated by Brazil's new constitution adopted in 1934, and immigration restriction law in Peru in 1936. In these countries, Japanese immigrants were viewed as unassimilable and a potential threat for national integrity and security. During World War II, Brazil severed relations with Japan, Japanese newspaper, and teaching the Japanese language, etc. Let me skip a little bit because there's a little bit too much detail here. Okay. In 1943, approximately 10,000 Japanese immigrants, along with Germans and Italians who lived in Santos of Brazil, were ordered to close their homes and businesses and move away from the Brazilian coast within 24 hours. So those are the kind of the measures taken by the Brazilian government. Let me then move on to the post-World War II Japanese migration to Latin America. Facing the total devastation and acute food shortages after World War II, the Japanese government in Tokyo and Ryukyu government in Okinawa, which both are under US occupation, promoted immigration as a potential solution to overpopulation and began to coordinate and sponsor immigration programs. While many countries understandably were uninterested in accepting Japanese immigration, some countries like Bolivia and Paraguay were eager to introduce labor migrants to develop their struggling agricultural industry. For example, as a result of the coordinated effort among Ryukyu, Bolivian, and the US government, Colonia Okinawa, a farming settlement in eastern Bolivia, was established in 1954. During the next 10 years, approximately 3,200 Okinawans migrated to and settled in Santa Cruz Department. The Japanese government of the mainland also facilitated approximately 1,700 Japanese mainlanders migration and settlement in Colonia San Juan de Yapacani in the same Santa Cruz Department in 1950s and 60s. As the Japanese economy underwent significant growth in the 1960s, Japanese immigration overseas decreased dramatically. As a result, Japanese government changed its role from promoting immigration to providing aftercare for migrants living overseas, including Latin America. Latin American Nikkei migration to Japan. From the 1980s, thousands of second and third generation Latin Americans have migrated to Japan. The migration, often called dekasegi or sojourning. The dekasegi migration was facilitated by a few factors. Japanese economy, whose growth had relied upon the abundant surplus labor in the forms of rural to urban migrants and women, was experiencing severe labor shortage, especially in the construction and the manufacturing sectors, and needed to fill what are commonly referred to as 3K, kitsui, difficult, kitanai, dirty, or kiken, dangerous jobs. In response, the Japanese government in 1990 revised the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act, which allowed entrance of foreign nationals of Japanese heritage, or Nikkeijin, mainly from Latin America, as well as their immediate families. Japanese Latin American Nikkeijin population grew quickly in the 1990s and early 2000s, peaking at about 375,000 in 2007, or close to 20% of the entire Japanese foreign population at the time. Vast majority of the dekasegi migrants are from Brazil, but also a sizable number of migrants from Peru and others. Many of these migrants worked in factories and construction sites and formed communities in and around manufacturing towns like Toyota City. As you know, that the Toyota Motors headquarters and its subcontractors are located in Aichi Prefecture and Hamamatsu City in Shizuoka and Oizumi City in Gunma Prefecture. I want to just briefly mention that sort of recent situations. The 2008 global economic crisis and subsequent sharp economic downturn had a profound impact on Latin American Nikkeijin in Japan. In 2009, the Japanese government launched a program that offered cash payments for Latin American Nikkeijin to leave Japan. This pay-to-go home scheme offered approximately $3,000 to workers and $2,000 per dependent willing to leave Japan. Approximately 20,000 Latin American Nikkeijin took up the offer, and many others left on their own. Between 2008 and 2010, the number of Brazilian and Peruvian populations shrank by more than 87,000 and have continued to decrease in recent years. As of 2020, 208,000 Brazilian, 48,000 Peruvian, and about 6,100 Bolivian nationals reside in Japan, according to the government. Among those Latin American Nikkeijin who continue to live in Japan, many are sort of circular migrants who regularly move between Latin America and Japan. They work and save money in Japan for several years and return to Latin America in hope of starting a small business, or buying a farmland, or retiring, only to find that these were not viable prospects. Only between 9 to 13% of Latin American Nikkeijin are estimated to have become naturalized Japanese citizens, despite the fact that many of them have lived in Japan for decades. Second generation Nikkeijin who were born in Japan or migrated to Japan when they were young suffer from these precarious conditions. They tend to possess low-level fluency in Japanese language and educational attainment. Due to the lack of adequate Japanese as second language education and other supportive programs for non-Japanese speaking students, lack of parental involvement in schooling, and bullying by their Japanese peers at school. I want to end the discussion by highlighting a few unique characteristics of the Japanese diaspora in Latin America and Japan. First, the Japanese state played a prominent role in promoting and shaping migration and engaging the immigrant communities abroad. Japanese state used immigration as a population control and economic development strategy as a means to expand the sphere of influence of the budding empire and as a tactic to suppress potential social unrest in Japan. Second, the profound impact of anti-Japanese discrimination was felt across the Japanese diasporic communities in the Americas. Due to the power of the US possessed over Latin America, many Japanese immigrants in Brazil, Bolivia, Mexico, and Peru faced expulsion and internment during World War II, as I mentioned. Finally, there were robust inter-regional and intercontinental movements of Japanese migrants throughout history. When the US restricted and excluded Asian immigration, the Japanese migration shifted to Latin American countries. When Brazil restricted Asian migration in 1934, Japanese migration flowed into Paraguay, for example. As such, the history of the Japanese diaspora that spans across multiple nation states and continents, shaped by changing global economic trends and state policies, exemplifies the often unexpected complexity and entanglement transnational migration has brought to the modern world. Thank you very much, and I will pass on to Rachel.
Thank you, Dr. Suzuki. Dr. Lim, please. Thank you.
Yes, I'm still muted. Hi, everybody. Let me just get my PowerPoint up and started. So thank you so much for all the attendees who are here today. And thank you to George Washington University for inviting me here, and Dr. Ishizawa for the introduction, and especially Richard Haddock, because I know you did a lot of administrative labor to put this event together. My talk today, it's sort of drawing from field work that I conducted mostly from 2017 to 2018 when I lived in Mexico to conduct full-time field work. And I'm also just going to talk a little bit about the broader context of Korean migration to Mexico. So the story of Korean migration to Mexico actually begins in the Yucatan Peninsula, which is on the Caribbean coast of Mexico. And basically, there were about 1,000 Korean contract laborers who were brought to the Yucatan to work with the hacienda plantations there. And the primary cash crop was something called henequen, and you can sort of see it here. And this was a sort of cash crop that was produced to make these durable fibers that were really enriched the sort of hacendados who were working in this region at the time. And Koreans were part of a larger kind of multi-ethnic workforce that included Maya, Yaqui, and Chinese laborers. And by all accounts, this work was brutally difficult. There were really poor working conditions, illness was rampant, and Koreans were under this sort of debt peonage system where they were onto contracts where much of their money was then used to pay off their debts. And so from the sort of firsthand accounts of this labor, it was really a kind of brutal situation. And this situation was really complicated by the geopolitical conditions of the time. And so the Koreans to Mexico, they had left in 1905, which was the year that Korea became a protectorate of the Japanese Empire. And then by 1910, they were annexed. And this meant effectively that Koreans no longer had citizenship and also did not have a homeland to which to return. And then also in 1910 was the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution, which meant that in Mexico, the situation was quite turbulent. Yucatan was a little bit protected, I think, somewhat from the situation, but still this was a sort of era of great geopolitical change, national change, in which Koreans were inserted. So from the haciendas of Yucatan, Koreans moved to other parts of Mexico. They went to Mexico City, they went to Tamaulipas, they went to Tijuana, and they sort of followed similar patterns of becoming sort of small immigrant shopkeepers, or maybe shoemakers, or jewelers. Sometimes they were candy makers, so sort of kind of peddling goods and things like that. And others actually became quite successful later on in the generations. And another sort of interesting facet of this early migration was a remigration from Mexico to other places. So for example, one kind of fascinating facet of this history is about 300 people left Yucatan and then went to Cuba in 1921. And I actually don't have too much time to talk about this, but I recommend two amazing documentaries, one called Jeronimo and the other one called Homeland Cuba, Korea, USA. They're really great documentaries about the sort of experiences of Koreans in Cuba. And so I'll just move on. And so in the case of Koreans living in Mexico during this period, they were sort of connected more broadly to Koreans living in the United States and in Cuba through an organization called the Korean National Association. And so there's evidence of letters and newspapers being circulated at the time that sort of kept Koreans diasporically connected during this time period. And then today, if you were to visit Merida today, there is a Korean museum, so a museum of commemorating Korean immigration. And at this museum, they have some exhibits, and they also host some cultural community events for the descendants of Koreans who are living there today. So basically from this first migration until the end of the 20th century, there wasn't really significant Korean migration to Mexico. And so if you look at this sort of graph that's from the South Korean government that's recording Korean migration to Mexico, you can sort of see that there weren't very many people showing up. And then right at the end of the 20th century, you see this spike, and then population sort of levels off. And when I showed up in 2017 to do field work, most of the people that I met who were ethnically Korean were actually part of this relatively recent wave of migration. People who had showed up maybe like 1998 to 2002 was like sort of the bulk of the time period of people who were in Mexico and had remained. And so to sort of explain this broader context, there's sort of broader, I guess, global trends. And so one of the big ones is NAFTA, so the North American Free Trade Act, infused global capital into the country, but also incentivized South Korean companies to relocate to Mexico because then they could sort of easily move goods to the United States, which was their primary aim. So you would see like lots of announcements of large Korean steelmaking companies, car companies setting up factories and other kinds of economic bases in Mexico. And that, of course, brings over recent migrants who are sort of looking for economic opportunity. But one thing that really surprised me was that when I talked to people about why they came to Mexico, the sort of biggest context was actually the IMF crisis. So this is the Asian financial crisis. Just to give a little bit of context, the 1997-1998 Asian financial crisis was basically a time in which the South Korean economy was restructured and there were these sort of harsh terms attached to an IMF, or International Monetary Fund, bailout that basically made new rules for the governing of debt. It opened the economy to foreign investment, and it reformed the labor market to make it easier for firms to fire people. And so these sort of economic policy prescriptions were robustly protested by South Koreans. And there were also many people that I met in Mexico that told me sort of similar stories of having been fired from their firms, having lost their pensions, and then sort of starting over in Mexico because they knew, a cousin or a distant friend or something like that who had moved there. And then alternatively, the other part of the story was the sort of related economic crisis in Argentina. So this at the same time, or roughly the same time that you see the Asian financial crisis in you see a similar crisis in Argentina and Brazil. And of course, economists like Padma Desai, for example, has argued that this was a financial contagion in which there was a sort of adverse external shocks that were connecting the economies of Asia and Latin America. And in Argentina, the sort of financial crisis and economic depression there impelled people to leave. And so this is just a news article talking about 20,000 Koreans emigrating from Argentina because of the financial crisis there. And I met a lot of people also when I was in Mexico, people who had come actually from Argentina. They spoke Spanish and they knew that they had to leave the country, and they felt that Mexico was like a more familiar kind of language barrier place where they could speak the language and were familiar with sort of Latin culture. Actually, it was quite common to meet people who were re-migrants from elsewhere in the Americas. And so when I showed up in 2017, there was sort of this mixture of people in Mexico City, for example, where you would have recent migrants straight from South Korea who are maybe on short-term work contracts working for large Korean multinationals. There were sort of re-migrant populations who are mostly ethnic entrepreneurs working in either the ethnic economy or in sort of larger informal markets like Tepito, as Professor Huda Hart had mentioned. And then, of course, there are also the descendants of Koreans who had migrated in the early 1900s. And because of this sort of itinerant immigration patterns, it was a really common joke among the community that people would say, so 이민자 like means immigrant in Korean, but people would say, oh, we're not immigrants. And the word 이민자 like literally means two. It sounds like two migrant. I guess it doesn't literally mean it, but it sounds like the word two migrant. People would joke and we would say, oh, we're 삼민자 or 사민자. We're three migrants or four migrants. We've sort of migrated so many times. And so these sort of serial migration patterns are really common, I think, probably across the East Asian diasporas and across East Asian immigration patterns as we've seen in the previous two presentations. And so this community, though, has become somewhat more settled. And so you're starting to see the formation, for example, of ethnic community organizations and gatherings and things like that, which was also a big part of my fieldwork while I was there. And there are sort of unique challenges as well faced by this particular community. And so one sort of comment I want to point out is that one thing that really surprised me when I first moved to Mexico is when I was searching for housing, I would find announcements online, for example, saying specifically, we don't accept students, pets, or Koreans for apartments. And this sort of singling out of Koreans really surprised me because I was kind of confused as to why the housing market was sort of explicitly, or why landlords were explicitly rejecting Koreans. And part of this I found out was that there was a kind of association, like in Mexico City, that Korean merchants were working in Tepito, and that on top of them working in Tepito, which is a sort of informal market that's kind of characterized by being dangerous and unstable, that they were basically a kind of mafia that controlled the streets of Tepito. And so this idea that Koreans are controlling the streets, they're selling counterfeit goods, they're bringing in drugs, and so the sort of criminalization of that population made it so that they were undesirable neighbors in the sort of middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods of Mexico City. And so here's another one too, where the ambassador had to come out and say, we're not a mafia. But then the sort of other flip side of this is the sort of explosive popularity of Korean popular culture in Mexico. And so it was not uncommon for me, for example, to see like dance groups in the Zocalo or Korean popular culture. And so the popularity and the sort of rise of South Korea's global image has produced opportunities for a lot of Korean merchants who are now selling Korean cosmetics or selling K-pop t-shirts and things like that. And so they're sort of negotiating between these two images in which on the one hand, they are often criminalized, and on the other hand, they are sort of treated as this globally palatable, kind of consumer-friendly country. And so I like to think about Korean migration to and from Mexico in terms of these broader trajectories. And so that includes the sort of individual trajectories of individual migrants as they're remigrating across the Pacific and the Americas. And then the sort of perceived trajectories of nations. And so I think migrants are really responding to the kind of shifts within the world order that's very much ratified by race and economic ideas of development, the sort of rise of South Korea as being this kind of culturally desirable location, then affects how people in Mexico are responding and how Koreans in Mexico then attempt to sell Korea in certain kinds of ways. People leaving places like Argentina or other places in South America because of lack of perceived opportunity. And so there's these sort of trajectories of, I think, national development and national futures that migrants are also negotiating. And the third is that, of course, these different trajectories produce a real diversity of experiences. So among Koreans in Mexico, you notice people who are mixed race, who speak Spanish, who are more comfortable with Korean. And so these kinds of diverse experiences, I think, are very much sort of creolizing or mixing in these local communities. And so just as a conclusion, as what we're seeing maybe right now, there's actually a sort of rise, I guess, of second generation of Koreans in Mexico who are making YouTube videos and are making, through social media, kind of diffusing their sense of identity and exploring what it means to be Korean in Mexico. And so this is an image of the Koreano Vlogs, which is a page of Christian Kim, who's like a Korean youth who lives in Mexico, and he has over 4 million subscribers, and he sort of produces these videos. There's also been moves on the sort of legislative front of Korean communities pushing, for example, for the Mexican government to recognize their contributions. And on May 4th was declared the Day of the Korean Immigrant. And so this is a little magazine image that was celebrating this. And so these kinds of, I think, like cultural projects, I think, are really interesting in showing the ways in which Korean identity and what it means to be Korean in the context of Mexico is constantly shifting and being negotiated in relation to these different trajectories. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and we have received a lot of great questions. So I'd like to go over as much as we can in the last 30 minutes. So I would like to mix my questions to take advantage of being a moderator a bit, but I would try to incorporate the participants' questions with mine as well wherever I can. So firstly, Dr. Hudehart, I was one of the participants was also interested in about Afro-Asians, and what's the unique about Afro-Chinese Caribbeans. And I was thinking a similar question, that how are they different from other Chinese migrants? And when I think about Black Chinese intermarriage in the United States, it's perhaps rare compared to other white Chinese or white Asian intermarriage. So if you could speak a little bit about that uniqueness of Afro-Chinese Caribbean that you mentioned.
Okay. The larger point I wanted to make is that because the early migration until the post-World War II, more recent migration, consisted mainly of men, and they stayed away for long periods of time because during that period, it was not so easy to go back and forth. They formed relationships, or what I call intimacies, with local women. And in the case of the Caribbean, local women were mostly of African descent. So you have the vast majority, I haven't done any kind of a formal survey, is that the vast majority of mixed race people in the Caribbean, from Cuba to Jamaica, and I can name many, many examples, two of them were Naomi Campbell and Colin Powell, were Chinese and people of African descent, what I call Afro-Caribbeans. You know? Now, that may strike a Caribbean person, a Cuban person, Jamaican person, it's nothing unusual because they see that all the time and it's a common phenomenon. But I do think when you speak to a North American audience, that does strike people as unusual because in the United States, let's face it, Asians and Blacks are often pitted against each other, competing for space. You know, we have the LA example, we have New York examples. You can find lots of examples. So it's my way of saying that is not inherent in being Asian or being of African descent to be antagonistic and hostile to each other, but that they find themselves in circumstances that do not allow much collaboration, intimacy, and close relationship. And let me just conclude very quickly by saying that in Cuba, the Chinese participated with Afro-Cubans who were enslaved people or free Blacks in the Cuban Wars for Independence. And they were honored as what they call mambises, or freedom fighters. So it's just a nice story, but also I think an important story to highlight when we look at Chinese, and it breaks the stereotype that Chinese don't like to mix with anybody. It's just not the case when you look at Latin America. It's more the race laws of the US that prevented or disallowed us to recognize race mixture. But in Latin America, it's quite common. In Mexico, of course, they mix with local women who are mestizas, or other kinds of racial heritages. I don't know if maybe Taco and Rachel, they seem to have some thoughts about that too, no? And
please feel free to jump in,
yeah,
Rachel and Taco, if you have thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think part of that. Oh, sorry, Rachel.
No,
You have...
please go.
Okay, just briefly. Yeah, and of course, the Japanese have a lot more significant presence in Brazil, which is also,
right.
Has a large Afro-Brazilian population.
Yeah.
And I think there's this sort of encouragement of this racial miscegenation rather than, the so-called one-drop rule in the United States that emphasized on racial separation. Definitely played a role in encouraging those kind of interracial, intimacies and unions. I'm not, of course, saying that it didn't, produce some, the colorism in its own way. It's not a, some sort of racial multiracial utopia. That's not obviously not the case. But I think that the psychological barrier for the racial miscegenation, either between Asians and Afro descents or, other mestizos, I think the psychological barrier would be lower than it has been in the United States.
Yeah, I think that was also definitely the case for Koreans in Mexico. If you look at the case of the migrants who came in the early 1900s, for example, you see a lot of intermarriages between the Koreans and the local Maya population. And so that produces a kind of interesting other kinds of identities that are both indigenous as well as migrants. And so I do think that there is definitely colorism and a kind of racial hierarchy in the context of Mexico, where I don't want to deny that, but I do agree, sort of broadly speaking, that racial mixing was seen as something that was not quite as well. It wasn't illegal, for example, in like it was in the United States.
Great, thank you. And I have a questions about second generation and higher generations. Dr. Suzuki, Japanese, like in Peru, there was Japanese President Fujimori, and that signifies the complete integration to the extent that that's the sign of civic incorporation of immigrant descent. But at the same time, in your book about Okinawan Bolivians, you mentioned that second generation Okinawan Bolivians are not experiencing upward mobility. Instead, they go back to Japan to do dekasegi, to be a labor migrant. That's actually more lucrative than staying in Bolivia. So if you could speak a little bit about the kind of divergent pattern, and maybe Fujimori is almost similar to the Obama, so that it's not maybe that's the outlier instead of the pattern. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Sure. Yes. Thank you for the question. Yes, indeed. And there are some, obviously that differences in different countries, different destinations. But I can sort of, one thing I can generally point out is that there's a significant sort of differences between what I described as a pre-World War II migrant communities, Japanese migrant communities, and post-World War II Japanese migrant communities. And that what I mainly studied and wrote in the book about Okinawan Bolivians in Bolivia are post-World War II migrants. And Fujimori and his daughter, both became prominent politicians in Peru, were descendants of the pre-World War II migrants. And they were, as I described briefly in the historical description, many of them after the initial end of that sort of farm labor in the sugarcane farms, many moved to the cities and lived among non-Nikkei Peruvians. So it clearly sort of created this more, conductive environment for the socioeconomic integration, which ironically, of course, created this backlash against this what's viewed as a sort of socioeconomic mobile minority population. But overall, that those earlier migrants and their descendants have achieved more mainstream socioeconomic success. So I would point out that this, different distinct periods of migration and different degrees of urbanization of the population, partly thanks to this different periods of migration, created that divergence between those who achieved the higher level of socioeconomic and even political success and those who have not.
Great, thank you. And that leads to the question to Dr. Lim. The participant, Carol, has asked, what are the present stats on Koreans in Mexico? And perhaps that could be linked to the question that I asked to Dr. Suzuki, that at the end of your talk, you mentioned about second generation Koreans and how are they integrated into Mexico compared to their parent generations?
Yeah, I think in terms of the second generation, or maybe the 1.5 generation, people who migrated to Mexico at a young age and are perhaps more culturally comfortable there, most of the sort of first generation or immigrant generation folks that I talked to would tell me, oh, we're definitely going to go back to Korea. This is just a short-term stay. But of course, after 20 plus years living somewhere, their children would feel much more comfortable in Mexico. And so I think one thing that very much struck me was that a lot of the younger people that I met and talked to were actually living quite transnational lives. For example, they fully expected that they were going to study in Mexico and then perhaps go back to South Korea to do a 4-year degree. And then they expected to come back to Mexico to work there. And so they sort of lived much more, I think, fluidly between the two countries than perhaps many of people. For me, I'm a Korean American second generation woman. And I think many of us we felt a stronger pressure to assimilate and to become Americans in certain kinds of ways. And I don't think the people in my peer cohort in Mexico felt that same pressure. And so they will speak Spanish fluently, but perhaps invest a lot more time in also learning to speak Korean fluently because they see those skills as necessary in order to maybe further their family's business, or that they do see themselves as living for an extended period of time in Korea sometime down the road. And so these sort of, I think, the sort of fact of this kind of transnational circuits between Korea and Mexico and perhaps other places in Latin America make it so that I think they're much more comfortable with this idea of perhaps moving multiple times throughout a lifetime and maybe even envision their trajectories encompassing that. But I think it kind of remains to be seen. One thing that we've also seen during the coronavirus pandemic is which is of course very recent and the situation is constantly changing, but many of my friends who could actually afford to go back to South Korea did so because of the fact that they felt that the situation in Mexico was less secure, or because people stopped going to their shops because of fears of catching coronavirus in the early stages of the pandemic, or just because of lower cases, I guess, in South Korea versus Mexico. Of course, this sort of access to be able to just pick up your life and move to another country is, of course, limited to a sort of upper middle class or perhaps elite people there. But I do think that that has, from what I understand, has actually lowered the number of Koreans currently residing in Mexico, because a lot of people have selected to move if they do have the means to do so.
Great, thank you. And the next question is from Jenny Wang Medina from Emory. She says, thank you for these wonderful presentations. This is for all of the speakers. And can you speak to the interaction between these national affinity groups? Was there a cultural sense of Asianness apart from an externally imposed racialization? Did this develop with later generations? Anyone who could jump in to this question?
Let me start then, because I'm very curious actually to hear the others panelists' view on it. So the two cases I'm most familiar with, Peru and Bolivia. There are many of the Japanese Okinawan immigrants and their descendants I encountered, at least once in their life, usually more than so, were mistaken as Chinos, Chinese. That's a catch-all terms for Asians in those two countries. And the many those who migrated from the rural, the migrant settlements to urban areas, interacted with the Chinese Peruvians and Chinese Bolivians. And so there was sort of some sense of that affinity with, in those two cases, primarily Chinese, ethnic Chinese populations. But that probably that questionnaire also notes this. But Asian American identity in North America, in the United States, primarily developed on the college campuses in 1960s. Under the very specific circumstances of, on the heel of the civil rights and Black Power and those all, ethnic consciousness movements. So that I haven't, as far as I know, I've seen that sort of similar kind of circumstances happening in, say, Peru and Bolivia. I was familiar with. So yes, so there are some sense of affinity there, some sense of familiarity there, largely because just like in the North America, in the US, North America, that different Asian groups are seen as just all the same. So there's that same aspect of racialization that created the sense of affinity, but I haven't seen, however, that has led to the more coherent sense of Asian Peruvian or Asian Bolivian identity.
Sorry, I'm muted. Dr. Fudehart, are you?
Okay.
Yes.
I was saying in Peru for the longest time, they have an association called Tusan. Tusan is Chinese, Tusan, or Tosan in Cantonese, which is the language their family used to speak, meaning native born. And they publish magazines and novels. Xiu Gamwan is a wonderful Chinese Peruvian award-winning novelist who writes in Spanish about life in Peru, in Lima's Chinatown. So yes, there is that kind of self-identity as being Asian or Tusan, meaning I'm second generation. I don't know Chinese. And they write beautiful things. They have a magazine called Oriental. So there is that kind of identity and self-identity and identity with others, no? So, but that is kind of fading, I think, with each progressive generation. However, here's an interesting thing. As China rises, and you see that phenomenon in the US and in Latin America, the Chinese descendant communities suddenly like to become more visible and identify with China because of the rising power of China. Now, when China itself was weak and being maligned and being attacked, that the Chinese would tend to stay more hidden. But with China rising, you see the Chinese communities, or I say Chinese descended communities, maybe some of the Xinyi, the new immigrants, identify with China once more. But there was another question about these two generations. I don't see too much connection between the Xinyi and the old immigrants, in large part because the older immigrants are of mixed heritage, mixed race, don't speak Chinese. And the new immigrants speak mostly Chinese and Putonghua or Mandarin, and don't speak the local language, Spanish or Portuguese, very well. So there's a huge cultural gap between these two migration flows. And very quickly, I was invited to a very interesting event recently in May of just this year. The president of Mexico formally issued an apology to the Chinese community for historical racism and violence and murders. Well, who was prominently featured in that ceremony, that official ceremony? The Chinese ambassador, meaning the PRC ambassador to Mexico. He was given a prominent role in the ceremony. And then later on, the local Chinese community huddled with him, literally. They had a long secret meeting about Chinese investment in Mexico. So you can't separate out, no, the international and the global and the local.
The question about thinking about pan-ethnic racial formation is really interesting in the context of Mexico. I think Dr. Suzuki already covered a lot of the main points that I think in Peru and Bolivia, and in Brazil, I think it's actually quite similar in Mexico, where you don't have the sort of history of racial organizing on US campuses and the sort of idea of producing a pan-ethnic solidarity between different groups from a sort of amorphous area called Asia. I don't think that history exists in the case of Mexico. And so you don't actually see people identifying as being Asiatico in any kind of way. The sort of Koreans also tell me frequently that people will call them Chinos, or that their nicknames when they were growing up in school, they were just El Chino or Latina or whatever. So I think that sort of moniker is something that does unite the experiences of people who look vaguely East Asian who are in Latin America, that they'll probably be called Chino. I think that there are sort of instances, however, of more ephemeral or maybe everyday encounters. And so, for example, in Tepito, when I was doing fieldwork there, many of the Korean merchants that told me that they worked with Chinese intermediaries who helped them bring their goods and who were maybe responsible for the markets in the sort of in Acapulco, or that they use different kinds of contacts that they formed when they were working in northern China. And so these sort of inter-ethnic business connections, I think, were quite powerful. And if you were going to go to Zona Rosa today, which is the area of Mexico City where most Koreans are currently living, you'll also see actually nearby a Japanese ethnic enclave and also a Chinese ethnic enclave. So just sort of on an everyday level, if you walk into a Korean grocery store, you're very likely to see other Asian ethnic groups shopping there, for example, or perhaps eating at their restaurants together. And so I'm kind of curious, I think maybe in a few years, the sort of sustained interactions that you'll see on the kind of sort of local level on the streets perhaps will produce those kinds of affiliations. And then I think the third thing I would say is for Koreans who are attending English language schools or international schools, so of course their families are a little bit on the higher edge of the spectrum of class, they have told me, many people have told me that their best friends in those international schools were other Japanese and Chinese students. And so I probably just because of cultural familiarity, or maybe that they formed tight friendships. And so, yeah, I think it's a good question, and perhaps things will shift with the second generation in later years.
Thank you. And I have a question to Dr. Hudehurt from Richard Eason, retired US Foreign Service officer who served in South America and at the APEC Secretariat in Singapore. And he is an alum of GW's SPIA master's program. So his question is, did the famous Manila galleon from Acapulco ever bring Asians back from Asia to reside in Latin America? Was it more than a trade in goods?
And that's a very good question, Richard Easton, and I should have addressed it. Yes, there was a huge migration in the 17th, 18th century We don't know exactly how many, but some estimates are as high as 50,000. And I showed in my PowerPoint very quickly one of those early Asian migrants who was a well-known Japanese businessman who settled down in Guadalajara. No, but he married a local woman, and he kind of faded from history. And the problem with these early Chinese Asian migrants who crossed the Pacific on the galleon ships is that they were all called generically Indios or Chinos. So we can't really tell you precisely what nationality or what ethnic group they belong to. My guess is that most of them were native Filipinos, that is indigenous Filipinos. That the Chinese who were called Sangle, which is a Chinese word, Zongle, which means in Hokkien, in the Southern Fujian dialect, come and go frequently, they were close to China. They have fewer reasons to want to take that huge, long, dangerous trek across the Pacific. Some Japanese came because they were Christians and they were persecuted at home. And Professor Suzuki referred to that. They were on their way to meet the Pope, right? Some of them, and we have documented stories about that. But that's because they were persecuted religiously. But most of those who went across the Pacific were native Filipinos, I think. And they then pretty much, I think, integrated into the local population. And they took the identity of Indio rather willingly, because in Spanish colonial Mexico, the category of Indio was a protected category. It has special protections from the crown. And so it was advantageous of them to accept that identity rather than insist on their particular Asian identity, which had no specific colonial protection. And some of them, I think Rachel mentioned, some of them are otaku, some of them came as slaves. So there was a number of enslaved Asians, the most famous one being La China Poblana, the a Mogul princess, a Mogul woman, meaning from India, from today's India, who was brought over as a slave girl, as an enslaved woman, but she died a saint, a lay saint, a beata. So that's another interesting story among the early migrants.
Thank you. And we have 5 more minutes. And so perhaps this might be the final question to all speakers. The question is, our question is from Lauren Mosley from SIIS researcher. How do these diasporas interact with their home countries in regard to politics? Do they often disassociate or hold even tight to their culture and national pride?
Well, I won't say very much. I just want to say I actually answered that question earlier when I told about the Chinese in Mexico suddenly becoming more visible because of the rise of China and because they wanted to be associated with a powerful China. For what reason? In large part, because they want Chinese investment into their own businesses and into their country, which they identify as Mexico.
So what I could say about that, the Japanese diasporic community's engagement with the sort of homeland, so to speak, politics, is that there weren't the electoral politics involvement. Of course, obviously they don't have voting rights, but what I could say about that is a prominence of the imperial family for the immigrant communities. Most of the community celebration, bicentennial celebrations, those kind of memorial celebrations involve that official guest, usually actually, interestingly enough, not only from the Japanese government officials, but also the member of the imperial family. So this, in some ways, the symbolic value of the imperial family is a prominent sort of feature of the diasporic Japanese communities. Of course, it's a little bit different for the post-war migrants and their communities, and not to mention that second and third generations, meaning significance of the emperor and imperial family is not the same for that, those earlier pre-war migrants. So in that sense, there are a sense of this engagement beyond economic level, but not in the sense of this nitty-gritty electoral politics and engagement.
I'll just say really quickly, in the case of South Korean migrants who are relatively recent, and so they're retaining South Korean citizenship, recently South Korea reformed their laws to allow participation in parliamentary elections. And so when I was there, for example, I saw the South Korean embassy organizing for election events and sort of encouraging people who are South Korean citizens to participate. And a lot of the embassy officials told me that they saw this election participation as a way to sort of reach out to the community and to sort of interact and to remind the South Korean citizens there of, South Korean consular services and things like that. And so there was a sort of that kind of outreach. In the case of recent migrants, one thing that I found very interesting actually is the intense efforts of the South Korean governments to make sure that migrants who left the peninsula before there was even a South Korea, to make sure that they see themselves as connected to South Korea and not to that other country in the north. And so there's actually very, very intense efforts to, for example, distribute South Korean flags, to distribute pictures of the peninsula with the sort of top half shaded out, and it's just the bottom half that's outlined in gold. And so, and those efforts have been actually quite successful. The South Korean government also runs homeland trips, language training camps, specifically targeted for descendants. And so that's not exactly political per se, but I think that those kinds of cultural efforts to reconnect the diasporas, I think are very potent and have really shaped the sort of sentiments, I guess, among descendants in Mexico today.
Yes. If I may just really quickly, China does the same thing. Both Taiwan and the PRC, they compete for the hearts and minds, and they give scholarships for them to go back. But don't forget to, Taku, you mentioned Fujimori. Fujimori went back to Japan to escape persecution for a long time, invoking Japanese nationality laws, which accepted him as a Japanese citizen because of his family's register, right? But I also want to say for all of you who are interested in the Japanese and Latin America, don't forget that Keiko Fujimori, Fujimori's daughter, is a leading politician in Peru today who almost won the last presidential election, representing the conservative ideology. So there is a lot of things going on, and Keiko Fujimori certainly educated at Columbia University, certainly a political figure to watch these days and to keep your eye on what's going on. I think she's a fascinating figure. Her mother, when she separated from Alberto Fujimori, actually headed the opposition party for a while. So guess what? Peru is not going to be is going to be continuously confronted with Japanese Peruvian politicians, because Keiko's brother is also a politician. So this whole Fujimori family on all sides of the political spectrum are very actively involved in politics. Finally, there are Chinese Mexicans. The most recent Minister of Gobernacion, which is the Interior Ministry, very high up next to the presidency, some would say, was named Osorio Chong, a descendant of a Chinese, in his case, actually a Chinese mother. So if you keep an eye on these things, you do see Asians. No, I mean, the Koreans, Rachel, is another interesting thing, because I spent a lot of time in Cuba. North Korea is in Cuba. They have a huge embassy, and they have a relationship with Cuba. So if you want to see where North Koreans are in Latin America, go to Cuba. There they are prominently present.
Thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. It was great to listen to, and we have many questions that we could not answer, but there was very lively discussion that I really truly appreciate all that speakers and participants to posing interesting questions. And with that, I would like to conclude today's event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.